A number of years back, I was the guest at a worship service on Easter morning, and I still remember the pastor saying something like, there's an energy, there's a power, there's an electricity on Easter, but we must be the conduits. The news, the great news of Easter has to flow through us. Image that I got is kind of like those science experiments. I don't know if the Baltimore Science Center has one, but I've seen this in other places. You put your hand on the ball and the electricity flows through you and your hair starts to stand on end. That person is a conduit. But in those science centers and in that experiment, if somebody grabs the hand of the person with their hand on the ball, their hair stands up as well. And you can actually get even a whole link of people. Easter's kind of like that. There's this amazing good news of the resurrection, of Jesus risen from the dead. And we have to let that flow through us and continue on to the world around us. And actually, if you look in each one of the gospel stories, we find this same idea. Each one of the gospels tells us a different way, in a different way particularly, how the good news, how the story of Jesus' resurrection gets spread and how the electricity keeps flowing. So in the Gospel of Mark, for example, the Gospel of Mark ends in this way. So the women, went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Like, what next? And I preached on that some years ago, it just leaves us kind of, what are they going to do? Of course, we know that they went and they spread that news, but Mark particularly leaves us wondering, will they go and spread the good news of what Jesus has done? And each gospel does it in a different way. In the Gospel of Matthew, we have the classic formal way of what's typically called the Great Commission. Jesus appears to the disciples and says, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you." We are sent out by Jesus to tell the world about what Jesus has done and said. That's how Matthew presents it. Luke is yet a different way again. Luke is also the gospel writer of the book of Acts. So Luke actually spends a whole nother book in which he begins. In the first book, Theophilus, I wrote to you about Jesus, and now I'm going to write a whole nother book about how the good news of Jesus spread in the early church. Luke gives us a whole book of how the early church began. And the Gospel of John, yet again, gives us a different description of how the news will be spread. It tells us about one disciple who really struggles with this knowledge about Jesus. It's the disciple who is almost always preceded by an adjective. It's never just Thomas, it's always doubting Thomas. We hear of the struggles of this one disciple, and that kind of pushes us forth in thinking about how this good news, how the electricity of Easter will be spread. I want to spend some time with this doubting Thomas this morning and think about him in us and in others. So we hear of Thomas in John, one of the four accounts of Jesus' life in the 20th chapter. So when it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear of the Jews, they're in hiding. They've crucified, they've killed their master, Jesus, and they're afraid this is going to happen to them as well. But Jesus came, even though the doors were locked, and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Now, peace be with you would have been a traditional greeting in the ancient world, but given that they've betrayed, abandoned, deserted, denied Jesus, perhaps they needed to know that Jesus was also at peace with them. So he says, "Peace be with you." And after he had said this, he showed them his hands and his side. There are still marks from the nails driven through Jesus' hands. And the Roman soldier took his spear and pierced Jesus in a blow that was designed to pierce both the lung and the hearts. That's why in the scriptures it says there's both water and blood poured forth, his lungs full of fluid and his heart. That side wound is still there. And then the disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord. This is their resurrection appearance. Jesus said to them again, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you." They are commissioned in this way in the Gospel of John. As God sent me, now I send you out into the world to tell others of what has happened. When he had said on this, he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit." They're not just sent, but they're given the power that they need, God's Spirit in them, to go about this. They're even given authority. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven them. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained. But Thomas, who was called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, they made sure that he knew what they had experienced. "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hand and put my finger in the nails and my hand in his side, I will not believe." Now, I think people tend to look down a little bit on Thomas for this attitude, but it makes perfect sense. When you see a dead person, you know that they're dead, and they knew that Jesus was dead. The Romans knew their business of putting people to death, and the killing blow with the spear, just in case there was any life remaining, made sure. Thomas is completely understandable. Jesus is dead, and there's absolutely no reason to believe anything but. Thomas's response is entirely logical and appropriate. But a week later, his disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were shut, again, Jesus came and again says, "Peace be with you." And then he said to Thomas, "Hey, Thomas, put your finger here and see my hands." He clearly knows what Thomas has said. "Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." And Thomas doesn't even need that proof being in the presence of Jesus. Thomas answers him, "My Lord and my God." This is his confession of faith. Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." That is, all the generations since the time of Jesus, including us. Blessed are we who have not seen but have come to believe. And then the Gospel of John ends in this way. Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. So I wonder about this Thomas in us, because at times we're like Thomas, and also the Thomases around us. I made mention last week, and you all know that there's less and less people that claim as a person of faith. How do we engage with these Thomases, sometimes inside of us and sometimes around us? A couple thoughts that we see about Thomas. First is start the conversation. You know, the other disciples, they didn't just keep the knowledge of experiencing the risen Jesus to themselves. They go and they tell Thomas, we have seen the Lord. Now, he doesn't believe. That's their job to convince him, but they want to make sure that he knows. And sometimes with the Thomases in us and around us, we gotta start somewhere. We gotta start the conversation. I think about it this way, perhaps, or at least one way. I really like Tasty Cakes. Growing up in the Philadelphia area, I've always been a big fan of Tasty Cakes. And if I go to the local Wawa and I see the Tasty Cake display, and it all looks really, really good, and they're 25 cents for a pie or a cake or some of their cookies or donuts, I'm going to buy a couple because they're on a super duper sale. And after I've stocked up, I might let somebody else know. Starting that conversation is just sharing what's been a blessing in our own lives. And we do this with all kinds of other things. You see a movie that you really enjoy, you talk to other people. Hey, I saw this movie, you might enjoy it. We read a book that we appreciate, we might pass the book on, or at least the name, on to somebody else. When we find a recipe that we really like, one of the things I love about St. Paul's and every church I've ever worked at is something's good on a potluck and somebody else, hey, can I get that recipe? And starts to pass around. We even have a cookbook full of the recipes of the folks of St. Paul's to pass on and share with others. It's just sharing what has made a difference in our lives. If the electricity, if the energy, if the power of Easter has touched and changed your life, pass it on. A couple folks have said to me that last week's message on the stone being rolled away has been a blessing. Some folks went and took extra stones and passed them on. The message is available online, so you can even pass a stone and send the link to somebody and say, I thought of you and thought this would be a blessing. Just begin somewhere and share this power of Easter with somebody else. And just be with the Thomases. You know, the Bible in the beginning, in the story of Jesus, it's called incarnation. The fact that God came and was with us in human form, and we often are the person that reaches out and connects and passes on faith to somebody else. To just be with the person. And if you think about your own faith journey, I'm sure there are things that have helped you grow in faith, oftentimes books or messages or, of course, reading the Bible. But oftentimes, and you probably can think about folks in your own life, it was somebody that reached out to you. It was a parent or a grandparent, an aunt or an uncle, a friend, a coworker, somebody who helped you along in your own faith journey. They reached out to Thomas, and we have to reach out to the world around us and just share the way that faith has been a blessing to us. So kind of be with the Thomases of the world and listen to the Thomases of the world. You know, folks have stories and challenges and difficulties. You know, if you went to your doctor with a problem, and after explaining it for 30 seconds, the doctor goes, oh, I know exactly what the problem is. I know how we'll treat it. You'd be like, yo, hold on a sec. Wait a minute here, doc. You know, I haven't quite finished yet. Let me describe fully the problem, and then we'll go about it. You know, you want your caregiver to listen to you. And the same thing is true of other people's faith journey. We got to sometimes just listen and hear where they've been, their point of view, their challenges, their difficulties. Many years ago, I was at a car dealership and ended up having a good conversation with the guy who was the service manager. He actually said in the course of the conversation, "Oh, I'm supposed to be a member of your church." You ever say that to me, you've just opened a whole interesting course of dialogue. And this guy had every reason not to be a person of faith based on some of the experiences in his life. But I listened to him. I spent some time hearing the journey that he had been on. And I think in the listening and the understanding, the hearing maybe even of what he'd been through, that helped bring him back to a place where he started to come back to faith and back to church. But it was only after listening to where he had been. So listen to the Thomases around you. And it's okay to be okay with doubt. You know, the doubt that Thomas expressed is perfectly logical, and the doubt of the world around us is okay. When you're interacting with a friend or a family member, a coworker, a neighbor, whoever it is, and they express doubt, that's normal. Think about it this way. The first disciples were confused and doubted. We have this wonderful example of a guy who saw Jesus do miracles and all the amazing things that he did. And Thomas still said, "Unless I put my hand in his wounds, I'm not going to believe." And in fact, in the Gospel of Matthew, I love the verse when it's properly translated, says that in the presence of the disciple, of the risen Jesus, the disciples worshiped and doubted. They had doubts even as they were in the presence of Jesus. So when the world around us or inside of us sometimes, when we have doubts, this is normal. This is okay. But go with it. Wrestle with those doubts. I always think I would much rather have doubt than apathy. There's some energy and there's some questions in doubt. When it's just like, oh, I don't care, it's a lot harder to make any progress. It sometimes makes me think about a dear friend of mine, Gary. Gary's got a good mind, and when he was a child, he would ask all kinds of questions. Maybe they weren't as much doubts as he was just trying to figure it out. And the pastor of his church came to his parents and said, he needs to stop asking so many questions. He just needs to believe. Well, they ended up leaving that church and actually went to a Lutheran church where Gary could ask all the questions he wanted and wrestle his doubts and his confusion and everything that his child mind was wrestling with. I love that they did that because my friend Gary is a wonderful minister, is powerfully used by God leading a congregation up in Pennsylvania. And had not somebody been willing to go with his doubts, maybe he would never be used by God the way that he is. So it's okay. It's okay to have doubts, even to be honest with our own doubts, to wrestle with the places that we've been. I came across this quote that I had never seen before. I thought it was a really good one by Mark Twain. When in doubt, tell the truth. It's okay. You know, there are times when I've said to somebody, there are things I don't understand about faith, things that don't make sense to me in the Bible about Jesus. At the end of the day, faith is still the best way for me. It's still the strength that guides my life. But it doesn't mean that I don't have doubts, that I'm still not trying to figure it out. And I think when we're willing to do that, to be honest with anybody that we're encouraging, that we have our own doubts and struggles too, it gives them freedom to wrestle as well. Let me end by just reminding you, and you may have heard this, that the Apostle Thomas, is said to have, and there's actually some archaeological evidence that he was one of the first Christians in India and went and traveled there. Christianity is not the largest religion in India, but today there's something like 30 million Christians in India. And they proudly name Thomas as the apostle, the disciple who went and first brought the message of Jesus to India. So even this doubter, even this guy who wasn't quite sure, was powerfully used by God. The energy, the power flowed through him, and it can flow through us as well. Amen.